Hello everyone, and thank you for deciding to view my presentation. Let me take you on a speculative journey through prehistory as we imagine a very different kind of Austroasiatic world. The starting point for this presentation is a reflection on Roger Blench's Waterworld paper. This argues that if early Austroasiatic speakers were largely following river basins, aquatic technology and subsistence must have been highly salient in their vocabulary. A number of lexical items can be shown to be common to many of the branches of Austroasiatic, suggesting them as reasonable candidates for the proto-language. This suggests, to me, that we should think of early Austroasiatics as boatmen and navigators as much as farmers and hunters, although this was framed by Roger as part of a subsistence strategy, not as part of a migration modality. Later, it struck me that Southeast Asia was also rich in estuarine environments, arguably much more attractive for hunting and gathering than inland rivers. Also attractive for early rice farmers, as river flats and deltas provide excellent farming lands. Have we ignored an important environmental niche and limited our thinking? We are all familiar with Austroasiatics as inland and upland dwellers, not so much as sailors or islanders. The latter exist, but outside of the Nicobars, they are the clear outcome of later processes. Also, later in the Metal Age, estuarine sites in Southeast Asia facilitated state formation and civilization, erasing earlier cultural and demographic patterns established in the Neolithic. So, what happens if we recalibrate our expectations and think of early Austroasiatic as having been an estuarine-oriented culture? Does any location stack up as a more likely dispersal locus? And by the way, I've kind of given up on the term homeland. It seems to me somehow too abstract, so I'm using locus of dispersal as a kind of proxy for this. Anyway, the places that have been considered in this respect, and it makes a big difference what chronology you calibrate for these, are numerous. Let's run through the most important proposals. Central China, somewhere about the Yangtze. This is premised on a very old chronology relating to rice domestication. Then there's southwestern China. Such a model puts Austroasiatic at the convergence of the great rivers, with migrations fanning out downstream. It could be an intermediary on the way from a Yangtze origin. Southern China, Guangdong, Guangxi, etc. Similarly, these could be a stepping stone from further north. Northern Indo-China. Well, this focuses on the Red River Delta, which is the prime estuarine site in the Neolithic context, which we'll be discussing mostly in this presentation. Central Indo-China along the Mekong. This was advocated by myself and Roger Blench a decade ago, as the diversity of Austroasiatic branches in or by the Mekong Basin is highly suggestive. Then there's the Bay of Bengal coast or hinterland. This comes about when one gives special emphasis to Munda as a primary branch of Austroasiatic, which shifts the centre of diversity west, but it all depends on your notions of phylogeny. Then there's eastern India, the Munda area particularly. Arguments over the origin of Munda typology have led some scholars to propose that it's the oldest area in Austroasiatic, which means that the migrations must have been eastward from India, although this idea has largely fallen out of favour lately. And most speculatively, the Punjab. Michael Witzel has argued that Vedic shows signs of a local substrate with Austroasiatic features, suggesting Austroasiatic speakers lived in the Punjab. We're not going to be pursuing these ideas in this presentation. So, of all of these, only 3 seem to offer viable estuarine loci. Both eastern India and the Bay of Bengal fit the profile, but there's little, even circumstantially, to correlate them with early Austroasiatic or the implied eastward migration of Neolithic rice farmers or millet farmers into Southeast Asia. Admittedly, millet seems to have emerged a bit earlier and further north within China than rice, and it led the spread of cereal cultivation chronologically. But millet is not the sexy grain. It's not pounded or husked. It's eaten whole. It is rice that requires harvest and preparation methods that yield a complex linguistic footprint that seems to be stamped onto Austroasiatic. So I'm thinking of an estuarine locus in the east, and the Red River Delta is the prime candidate. Well, Austroasiatic may have arrived there from somewhere further north or upriver, but there's a nagging problem that the Austroasiatic lexicon has little in common with any other Asian language family, despite various fantastical claims. I think it's more likely to have emerged as a distinctive culture in northern Indo-China, although it's easier to argue if it dispersed from there rather than to actually claim it originated there. But you know what I'm thinking. Well, various maps speculating on the origin and directions of migration have been offered from time to time. Basically, all of these assume the migrations were inland, although the Nicobarese must have finished their migration by navigating over water from the peninsula or from Sumatra. And this has mostly been regarded as a peripheral issue, not at the heart of Austroasiatic problem. Hence, we find maps like these with contradictory directional arrows, yet agreeing on, but placing no special importance on, the Nicobarese. All these inland models have no problem assigning paths that lead to locations along which Austroasiatic speakers are found today. They just don't agree on which ends of the arrows to draw the pointy bits. So let's just decide that this has not been getting us anywhere lately and have a rethink, which is what I've been doing. So in 2016 at the ICAL Syntax workshop in Chiang Mai, I asked if Munda arrived in India by people sailing around the Bay of Bengal. This was subsequently fleshed out in the published version as Rao and Sidwell, 2019, the Munda Maritime hypothesis. That paper offers various claims, mostly on the basis of geography. Firstly, the distribution of Munda languages is well explained by dispersals upstream and parallel to the coast from the Mahnandi-Brahmani Delta, tentatively correlating with the eastern wetland tradition dated by archaeology to around 3500 BP. And this correlates well with the Proto-Munda cultural lexicon reconstructed by Zaid. It is not so easy to arrive overland from Southeast Asia in Orissa. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta presents a significant barrier to migration in the Neolithic and later. At the same time, though, the Mahnandi-Brahmani Delta is the first hospitable landing place one finds sailing west around the bay past the vast mouth of the delta. And the adjacent Chilka Lake has functioned as a sheltered harbour and desirable estuarine fishery for millennia. It's just the right place for landfall when sailing from Southeast Asia. The linguistic evidence as such is pretty thin, but Munda does show closest agreements in numerals and pronouns with the Vietic and Bahnaric languages. These are located in modern Vietnam. There are no traces of any Munda connections along any overland route. So why couldn't the pre-Mundas be sailors? We accept that the Nicobarese sailed to their islands, yet we think little more of it because it seems like a one-off that's inconsistent with Austroasiatic culture, the predominantly lowland cultivators or highland Swiddeners that we're familiar with. Yet there is a clear implication that in Neolithic times there were Austroasiatic navigators who could cross a couple of 100 kilometres of ocean. We all kind of agree with this. And furthermore, we note that Bulbeck, 2004, proposes an Aslian homeland on the west coast of Malaysia. Austroasiatic navigators exploring the Andaman Sea coast could have made landfall and established the Aslian branch. Also, it does seem that Aslian and Nicobarese subgroup linguistically, so a proto-Nico-Aslian community on the Andaman Sea makes a lot of sense. Additionally, the recent genetic study by Tata et al. 2019 shows that Munda speakers share more identity by descent segments with Austroasiatic groups of the Malay Peninsula than with other Austroasiatic groups tested in the course of that study. This suggests a real population connection between the Mundas and our Nico-Aslians. This lends credible weight to our Munda maritime hypothesis. So this got me thinking, does an estuarine location, suggestive of maritime arrival, apply to any other Austroasiatic branches? Well, maybe I'm not even the first to think about this. More than 30 years ago, Harry Shorto remarked, "There seems to be no overriding reason to trace routes for the Mons and Khmers and other groups who occupied the river plains down the rivers from the hinterland rather than up them from the coast." And why not? As Chaim points out, the coasts of Southeast Asia, and particularly river estuaries, offer one of the world's richest habitats in terms of natural bounty. Hunter-gatherers living in such marine habitats can secure their territory through permanent occupation and become very rich in social, technological and economic terms. Not just hunter-gatherers, but farmers looking for deltas and river flats. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, archaeology has established that the earliest Mondavaravati settlements closely follow the highest water line of the Chao River during the mid-Holocene sea level maxima, suggesting that they developed from earlier settlements founded on the coast in Neolithic times when sea levels were higher than now. Similarly, the earliest archaeological indications of Khmer urbanism are found at Ok El in the Mekong Delta from the 1st century CE, when it was the trading port on the Silk Road, Maritime Silk Road. As Stark notes, at least 90 Ok El period complexes have been recorded throughout the southern Mekong Delta, and contemporary sites have been reported along the coasts of Peninsula Siam with similar material culture. So, the pattern is clear. The earliest indications of modern Khmer settlements are coastal around the Gulf of Thailand, with later expansion upriver and inland as the development of hydrological methods allowed for expansion of rice farming. Okay, that's early 1st millennium. What about further back in the Neolithic? The first evidence for domesticated rice in Thailand using macro remains dates to 2000 to 1500 BCE in the coastal site of Kok Phnom D. This is the location marked 9 on Castillo's map here. It's right on the edge of the Bangkok Plain. This was virtually shoreline at the time. There are potentially other sites in central and northern Thailand based on phytolith remains, but their evaluation remains problematic. The evidence for early millet at these inland sites, which may have come from the north, is much better. Castillo notes, Chaim originally proposed that rice agriculture expansion followed major riverine routes and would be archaeologically visible in interior sites, an idea previously put forward for Austroasiatic language expansion by Blust. However, Ban Takea and Ban Chiang are the earliest interior sites dating to the Neolithic that are reported to have rice cultivation, but the evidence is based on rice-tempered pottery, so it may be open to doubt. So, there is actually scant evidence for the expansion of rice cultivation down riverways as predicted by the traditional models of Austroasiatic dispersal. Rather, there are ambiguous indications of husk-impressed pottery at some sites, but no evidence of cultivation. We do have rice being grown by the Bangkok Plain in Neolithic times. Seems reasonable to suggest that the pre-Mons, pre-Khmers, and maybe other Austroasiatics settled by the coast initially, only later becoming oriented to the inland as their societies developed, and especially so after rivalries with various Austronesians became a factor. And there are other Austroasiatic branches that we can directly examine from this perspective. Looking at our prime candidate in North Vietnam, the Vietic homeland, it's not a matter of consensus, but many scholars do explicitly identify pre-Common Era Dong Son culture of the Red River Valley with Vietic, such as O'Hara, Felush, Chun, Taylor, and others. Vietics seem to have been living in the Red River Delta for as long as we can tell. The location of the upland groups may be a secondary consequence of evading Chinese occupation. I regard this area as our prime candidate for the origin and dispersal of Austroasiatic culture and language. Another potential coastal branch is the substratum in Chamic. This was discussed by Blench 2009 at the 5th ICAL. Thurgood's reconstruction of Proto-Chamic demonstrated nearly 600 words of non-Austronesian origin, roughly half of these confidently Austroasiatic. But the earliest stratum cannot be identified with any specific Austroasiatic branch. This strongly suggests that an unknown Austroasiatic community was speaking that language on the Vietnam central coast and was absorbed into Chamic. Also, Fairloose 2011 reconstructs the Peric homeland in the vicinity of Thailand's Trat province and Cambodia's Gokong province. While the coastal area is today dominated by Thais and Khmers, Peric people live only tens of kilometres inland. At the intersection of these provinces is the mouth of the Matuk River and the modern port of Gokong, which suggests a landing place for pre-Peric settlers, providing both sheltered harbour and ready access to farmable land. Now, we may be even bolder and speculate about Katuic and Bahnaric. Their centres of diversity are in the hills of the Annamite range. It's always been assumed, more or less, that they ascended the hills from the Mekong side, but it's not clear that this is the case. We do see hints of directionality in the expansion of Gui people westward into Thailand at Cambodia and South Bahnarics westward into Cambodia, but these look to be relatively recent given their internal homogeneity, say first millennium at the earliest, or maybe later in the case of South Bahnaric. Otherwise, their distributions are roughly along north-south axes. However, we do have the precedent of Chamic. We know for sure that Chamic communities in the central Vietnam hills reached there from the coast, having much earlier been migrants from the Austronesian world, probably from northern Borneo. The Vietnam coast was rich in estuarine sites attractive for settlement to early chums, and presumably before that to Katuics and Bahnarics. And it seems as good as any inland hypothesis that we suggest that in fact that the Katuics and Bahnarics came up from the coast. So, archaeology and genetics and other disciplines have revealed important details about what was happening in the lower Red River in late Neolithic times. Bellwood reports on the Munbuck Red River excavation site. Indeed, it is clear that in the centuries around 2500 to 2000 BCE, there witnessed some remarkable cultural and biological changes in Southeast Asia. South Chinese Neolithic populations with food production based on rice, millet, pigs and dogs pressed southwards, in the process settling alongside or simply amalgamating the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations. The science has demonstrated population mixing in northern Vietnam at the time, associated with specific cultural features that correlate with early Austroasiatic. I am increasingly of the view that Austroasiatics arose out of this amalgamation of incoming farmers and indigenous hunter-gatherers. There is no clear footprint of ancient Austroasiatics further afield in China. At best, the arguments are suggestive. Claims such as Norman and May's cited etymology for the name of the Yangtze are discussed, but such isolated lexical resemblances are cheap to come by. But even if there is a deeper origin within China, we have identified a context and a time frame for a population and culture transition and subsequent expansion out of northern Indo-China. A very specific claim of cultural dispersal has been made for the Vietic area. Fairloose, 2009, argues that Vietic preserves evidence of the morphological formation of the word for pestle from the verb to husk, from an older verb, che, with r in fixation. This reflects the specific innovation in Southeast Asia of the wooden husking mortar and pestle, which proved easier to make and which husks grains with less shattering compared to stone mortars. This may have been a key innovation among the early Austroasiatic rice farmers, carried widely as Austroasiatic dispersed. 9 branches including Munda, have evidence of this R-infixed derivative, and they're shown here. The root form is also phonologically marked. The initial ch phoneme is rare in the proto-sound system, belonging to a different correspondence to the voiceless palatal stop. Yet the derivative is widely spread in Austroasiatic. Felus supposed that the pestle word diffused by borrowing across Austroasiatic, but this makes no sense to me, given that it got even as far as Munda and yet not into unrelated neighbouring languages, despite its cultural importance. Surely it must have spread with the Austroasiatic demic dispersal, with archaeology and linguistics putting its origins in northern Indo-China. The Red River locus also works well for the dispersal of northern Austroasiatic languages. The geographically northern groups, Kasian, Palaungic, Hmong, Pakanic, Katuic, are readily explained by migrations upstream, along the Red River and its tributaries, such as the Law River and Black River. Eventually, the Khasi Palangs got to the higher reaches of the Mekong and Salween and took mountain passes to the Brahmaputra, and the latter is not really in dispute. Of course, a southwestern China dispersal with colonists coming down to the Red River and a secondary maritime dispersal is a possible consideration. But this leaves us with nagging problems, such as how to explain the so-called ostric etymologies of the northern languages. A good example is the bamboo rat word. You see some examples here. This is found only in Austronesian and northern Austroasiatic. Other examples can be found in Shorto's MKED and other compilations. Such lexical oddities may be explained by an Austronesian Austroasiatic contact at the coast rather than the hinterland. Otherwise, I have no idea what to make of them. There are, in fact, indications of Austronesian Red River contact around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago in the form of circle and dentate stamped pottery. Maybe such contact even influenced Austroasiatics in the use of watercraft. Well, here we are. Circumstantial evidence puts half or more of Austroasiatic branches spreading out from estuarine loci. We know that Neolithic people could navigate coastal waters, but we have scant indications of rice agriculture spreading inland across the Indo-Chinese peninsula or further west to India. Identifying the lower Red River as the locus of Austroasiatic dispersal allows for a rather neat account of language dispersal, such as sketched on the map here. We can propose two main vectors: upriver accounting for the northern groups, and another, a coastal dispersal, perhaps in multiple pulses, around the Indo-Chinese coast, settling in estuarine locations, and progressing around or across the isthmus into the Andaman Sea and beyond as far as India. They took with them rice and millet, and the wooden mortar and pestle and other linguistically reconstructible methods and items characteristic of Austroasiatic. Perhaps there were two Austroasiatic water worlds, one freshwater upstream of the Red River Delta, another consisting of coastlines and estuaries of Southeast Asia, now obscured by millennia of change. Well, that's all for now. The references are in the accompanying PDF. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your feedback. Cheers.